Should the Utah Hockey Club be looking to make a big move at the NHL trade deadline? We're going to talk about it on the Locked On Utah Hockey Club podcast.
You are Locked On Utah Hockey Club, your daily podcast on the Utah Hockey Club, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, everyone, and thank you so much for making us your first listen every single day when it comes to the Utah Hockey Club. I'm Tom Callahan, veteran NHL voice, and along with Robyn Leaño, veteran team analyst, we are the dynamic duo that brings you the Locked On Utah Hockey Club podcast. Thanks for joining us. And being here is today, we get into the trade speculation end of things. Robyn, the NHL trade deadline is coming up quickly. There are a lot of names that have been floated out there. Some of them are on the Utah Hockey Club. Some of them we actually covered in our trade targets of players that we thought that might be on the move from Utah, and we'll go over those in this show. But we also want to turn our lens to the rest of the league now, because we have talked about, hey, what it would take maybe to get something out of Utah. But now what does Utah want in return? And I want to start out with a conversation that Bill Armstrong had a little bit earlier in the week, where he was talking to Pierre LeBrun. And it was really interesting. He said, right now we like our group. We're going to see what we can do. It's got to be something dynamic to add into your group for us to make moves. Something dynamic that fits into our timeline. There is a lot in those couple of sentences. Something dynamic comes up twice, so obviously that's why I have it in quotes if you're watching on YouTube. Something dynamic, but Robyn, that fits into the timeline for this Utah Hockey Club. Once again, reiterating, this year is not the year. Year 2, year 3, year 4 in Utah. Those are the years.
Yeah, that's kind of where that's kind of what their goal is here. And I feel like, I mean, using those very specifically fitting the timeline, I mean, there's that, but also to me, it tells me that they are, that they have they have the timeline in place. They kind of know where they're at this year, and they have a plan in place, to continue to move forward. Which is, and I will say, better said, than, a lot of other NHL teams out there who, once they kind of build their foundation, they're like, all right, let's go, balls to the wall. That's not how you do it.
I didn't know that teams did that. Teams do that? Did they go crazy like that? I didn't think they did. We joke, right? But seriously, there are times when I think a lot of people question, does my GM know what they're doing? Sometimes I think people feel that way about their general manager and their president of hockey operations. What are they doing and why? And Robyn, I get that. I totally understand that sometimes you're just going to question it. So
right.
Before we get into looking at a couple of things, and I want to talk about, Robyn, you and I, we're going to debate position by position here. I just want to reiterate, wrong graphic, but while it's up there, I'll just tell you that our trade targets were Lawson Crouse, Karel Vejmelka, Nick Bjugstad, Ian Cole, and Alex Kerfoot. So those are still, I think, legitimate names to put on the radar. Lawson Crouse has come back since Four Nations, and he said he did a lot of reflecting during the break, but he's come back since Four Nations and looks like a rejuvenated player. I love that.
Oh, yeah.
That's fantastic for Utah Hockey Club. So he might have played his way off of there.
Sometimes you need that break.
Yeah, you do. You do. It can be a grind, mentally as well as physically. So, I mean, over the course of a season, a lot of things can get in your head, and confidence is weird and fickle. But so that makes him a bigger target for other teams, because now you see he's playing well, but that increases the price. So I think that there are players legitimately on there that Utah could look, especially at expiring contracts, that make sense to possibly move on from. But Robyn, let's look position by position at the Utah Hockey Club. Where do they need a player? Let's start with goaltender. Right now, you've got Vejmelka, Ingram, and Jackson Stauber.
Right. It's, to me, I like, And I feel like Utah's in a really good situation with goaltending, where they kind of don't really need a whole lot. I mean, they'll. Here's the thing: we've talked about it. There's a very high likelihood that they will be parting with one of their, starting goaltenders that we see from this season, either Ingram or Vejmelka. It really depends on, I guess, Vejmelka's can't. We talked about this. That leaves Staubert, to come in and do that. But what's interesting too is, I mean, you mentioned those three, but there's also another man who's kind of like right behind Matt Villalta, and then you got Michael Rabel still coming in the system. So like, I feel that goaltending, like they're in no rush to make any additions or any changes to their goaltending system.
Now, it sounds to me like, number one, just based on press conferences this week, Andre Tourigny has kind of awarded the number one mantle to Veg.
Yeah.
Deservedly so. I think he's earned it. I think he's played well enough to deserve that number one handle. He's got it. Now, the critical point becomes contract extension. He's done after this year. You don't want to lose this guy for nothing. He does have a high trade value to a team looking for a 1A or a really incredibly good 1B. His numbers are good, save percentage, goals against. The record's not there, but neither is Utah's. So I think on a better defensive team, he is an even better goaltender. Then the question becomes, if you can't, well, it's not even a question. If you can't work out an extension with Veg, I think he's the guy that goes.
It very much is that case. And I feel like we talked about this in the last episode, or one of our previous episodes this week and last week, just in general, of what kind of temperature is when it comes to potentially getting in Veggie, for on an extension, or either that or trade. And I think it really starts with at least gauging the temperature and being like, hey, do you want to be here? And I think it really is. It's just being like, hey, testing to see what the asking price is. And if that asking price is well beyond, Utah's means, and they can't afford it, then that's kind of like, okay, we can't really. There's only so much we can do here.
So can we agree then, you and I, that Utah is not adding a goaltender?
They will not be adding a goaltender.
Okay. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about defense and then the forward core. Where should Utah add, quote, something dynamic? We'll get into that here in just a minute. And the show's brought to you in part by Trade Coffee. If you're like me, your mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee. But I got tired of settling for the grocery store brands. They just weren't cutting it. And that's why I turned to Trade. And let me tell you, the coffee is next level. Trade is the number one specialty coffee marketplace in the U.S., bringing you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees. How do I get that job? Curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or you know exactly what you like, they'll handpick the perfect match for you. Now, the way I did it, because it was my first time with Trade, I actually took their quiz. I wanted to see what they were going to suggest for me. They ask you type of roast you like, whether you grind your own beans, if you want it ground, how you make the coffee, all of that. And in under a minute, they matched me with a roast that was fresh, smells incredible, and tastes even better. So my first bag, total game changer, just smooth, rich, so good. I have certain flavor profiles that I like in my coffee, and you can read up on all the tasting notes if you're one of those people like me. And I know Robyn is like that too. So if you're really into that, they actually have the flavor profiles on there for you. If you don't love your first bag though, don't worry, because Trade will replace it for free until they get it just right. So right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners and viewers 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com/LockedOnNHL for 40% off your first order. That's drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. All right, so as we talk a little bit into what should Utah Hockey Club add here, and again, keeping in mind Bill Armstrong saying something dynamic that fits into the timeline. Robyn, defensively, for this team as of right now, you have Sergachev, Durzi, and Marino locked up long term. Sergachev, $8.5 million with 3 years on his deal after this. Durzi, 3 years after this at $6 million. Marino, 2 years after this at $4.4 million. Expiring contracts: Ian Cole, 3.1, Oli Mata, 3 million, and Nick DeSimone, 775,000. Michael Kesselring is at 1.4 million for this season and next season as well. And of course, Robert Bortuzzo expiring 775. So that's your look at where things are right now. Vejmelka cleared waivers, is down in the minors, so you could see him again in the event that you end up trading not one, but maybe two defensemen and moving on from some guys. But by the same token, Robyn, you don't want to leave your cupboards bare, especially if you want to stay in the chase all the way up to the end of the regular season.
Yeah, it's a unique situation with the defense, and we've talked about it, right? We talked about what it's crazy, Tom, the conversation you and I have continually had about this Utah Hockey Club defense before the season, at the beginning of the season, just a couple of months ago, and today. It's like, I think, like 5 different levels of defense we've experienced. And we're still figuring it out, right? We're still figuring it out.
Yeah,
but
that's fair.
But to me, what it feels like is they have a core in place and they have people that they're comfortable with. And you mentioned a couple of, other players out there. There is, to me, appears that there's like so much depth in the defense. Like, it's hard to really make any new adjustments at this point.
And here's the thing. In Tucson, you not only have Vejmelka, who could come up, but you also have, don't forget, Maverick Lamoureux, who I thought showed well in his brief NHL stint earlier this year. I liked him. I don't know that I'm going to take a flyer on bringing up a Duda or a Zuber at this point, or an Onyebuchi.
It'd be coming pretty soon, though. I mean,
yeah, no, but if you want to stay in the playoff race, though, this year, is that the time to bring that kind of player in?
No, not this year. But if we're talking about timeline, they still fit the timeline.
They do still fit the timeline. Absolutely. They are still on ELCs. They're young players still developing. Kevin Connaughton is the old man in the sea down there. He's the 35-year-old guy who's down there as much an assistant coach as a player, honestly, helping him, come along. So, but the point is, you have 2 defensemen you've seen play NHL games that you probably have the confidence in to once again play NHL games. If you move, let's say you trade both, a Mata and a Cole, let's say you move both of those guys. You still have Bortuzzo, and you really only need to bring 1 defenseman up at that point because you'd be carrying 7. So I don't know if Utah needs to add a defenseman unless something crazy makes sense. But here's the thing. You have 3 really good defenders signed with some term. I don't know that you're looking to add on to that.
No, I think if anything, it's maybe like, a slight tweak in your system, but I wouldn't really see much else besides that. Like, they might say, like, okay, we want another defenseman who might fit our timeline just in case your Duda or your Zuber don't pan out, right? I mean, I could see that happening, but if we're talking about fitting the timeline and getting them, being someone that's on the roster much sooner, I don't see that.
I think that, too, not that you wouldn't take a prospect, especially if you think you're getting a steal on them. If somebody is just dying to add a veteran right shot defenseman and they come to you about, Ian Cole, and you're like, okay, well, the price is this, and they pay it. Okay, great. I
mean, it's possible to see, especially now that, Vejmelka cleared waivers, right? It's like, that is now Vejmelka, I think, has became like a sweeten the pot kind of deal. If they're looking to make some kind of addition like that. But
yeah, and that's the other thing. It doesn't, that doesn't preclude him from going anywhere. And again, the whole deal with teams didn't claim him on waivers. And you say, Tom, Robyn, who would trade for him if they could add him for free? Well, if you pick him up on waivers, you got to pay the whole boat of the contract. But if you're picking him up, there is the potential. So if he gets called back up and then traded, the Utah might be able to retain some salary, or depending on how that works, there's a lot of juggling that could happen. Then that might be why you don't like him at full value, but you might like him at half. So that makes sense to me, depending on a team's cap constraints. So, Robyn, are we agreeing that we don't think there's a defenseman coming in that's going to be something dynamic?
We are in agreement there.
Okay. Well, that kind of leaves us the forwards now, doesn't it? So let's take a look at the forwards. And here's what is going on. I'll just kind of run through these as quickly as I can. Clayton Keller through 27-28 at 7.15. Nick Schmaltz, 1 more year, 5.85. Lawson Crouse, 2 more years, 4.3 million. Expiring this year, let's just kind of quickly jump to those. Alexander Kerfoot, 3.5. Nick Bjugstad, 2.1, the boomerang. Jack McBain at 1.6. And then you've got Michael Carcone, 775 on an expiring contract. Everybody else is at least 1 more year. Michelli at 3.425, 1 more year. Hayton, 2.65, 1 more year. Stenlund, 1 more year at 2 million even. Liam O'Brien, $1 million a year for 2 years after this. And then, of course, Dylan Guenther, obviously, his extension kicks in next year at $7.142 million. So this year he's only $894. What a bargain for Dylan Guenther this year. So the expiring contracts are the interesting ones. Bjugstad, who we've seen move before and come back. That's why we lovingly refer to him as the boomerang. Kerfoot, $3.5 million, is another guy who, a 30-year-old center, veteran guy who could be a potential on the move. Kevin Stenlund, who I love, 2 years at $2 million. That's a reasonable contract. Outside of that, do you see, let me ask you this, Robyn, do you see a Lawson Crouse and Nick Schmaltz, any big names like that going anywhere for this team?
I mean, on their way out, I had a hard time seeing that, but you know, I could potentially see something. Yeah, maybe maybe something a little bit extra to be added in. Who knows?
So, I mean, if you're giving up a Schmaltz who's 29, can play up the middle, can play the wing, and wears an A for you. Obviously, part of the leadership group of this team. Not cheap at 5.85 million, but if you're a team that thinks you're a setup guy away, Nick Schmaltz could be your guy. And with only 1 more year after this, that's not too bad. And that's the other thing too. And maybe we should explain this to people. A lot of times teams don't necessarily want just a rental. It makes sense for someone who's offloading a contract to offload a rental, but the receiving team, especially if they like the player, would like some control over their future. They don't want to bring them in for nothing and lose them to free agency in the summer. They would like to have a guy with a year or 2 or 3 left on their deal. It makes sense for the receiving team to have that control.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are some scenarios. I mean, the rental works for those kind of teams that might be a little, quotes, like not necessarily cap constrained this year, but they might be a couple like next year or the year prior. And like, okay, we'd like to have you this year, but we can't afford to have you past this year. So like, we want to have you for a run and see if you are a, quote, difference maker. And that's that. But for the most part, I'd say a decent amount of times that's not the case. What you see is teams that are looking to make additions, looking in the long term in their own timelines and saying, all right, how can we see you make an impact not only this year, but next year, 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road? I mean, we've seen scenarios, Tom, where a team will go out and make a trade for a player, pretty big name player, like you probably mentioned, and say, we maybe even go for those sign-in trades. Like, let's get you an extension like right away. Like immediately upon trade, we'll get you an 8-year extension.
Yes. So, Robyn, with all of that in mind, and again, not only something dynamic, but something that fits the timeline, I've got some names I would like to suggest to you.
We'll do that right after this. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better way to get in on all that action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss opening tip-off or just want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're going for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I absolutely love how easy it is to use the features on FanDuel. I use it almost every single day when it comes to just tracking the bets and taking a look at things. And sometimes I won't necessarily maybe place a bet, but I will kind of take a look and play a little what if scenarios and say like, hey, let's see if I were to place a $1 bet on this 12-leg parlay in a single game for a same game parlay. I can do it. Maybe you want to do that if you are a Utah Jazz fan. I don't know why maybe you're a little over. Maybe you're one of the few that are very confident about how they are this year. Who knows? I won't judge. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com and join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Tom Callahan, Robyn, Leaño here with you on the Locked On Utah Hockey Club podcast. Adding something dynamic. What should Utah add? Those are the questions that we're asking ourselves. Bill Armstrong himself said something dynamic that fits in with the timeline. That's why it's in the quotes here if you're watching on the YouTube side. Robyn, that to me means a couple of criteria. Number one, fits in with the timeline means relatively young. Doesn't have to be, 5 years old. Needs to be somewhere in the 20s, around, right?
Yeah, I'd say mid-20s. Yeah.
Also, to me, sounds like not a short-term acquisition. Someone who's going to be around for a while that fits the plan. And we're talking, that means probably 2 more years of control, at least. So that's not easy. And like we just talked about last segment, the team acquiring always wants control. You don't want to lose a guy for nothing. And Utah is not in the business of acquiring rentals.
No, they wouldn't be. I don't think they'd be in that case, right?
Unless they're eating a contract that expires this year for something. That's the only way I could see it.
But if we're talking about a Utah Hockey Club team that is on the verge of a wild card and might want to at least try to make a soft push this year to see how close they could make it, I would not we probably wouldn't see that happen, and we'd see them make that dynamic. I don't necessarily splash is the right term, but definitely that dynamic acquisition.
So ignoring the fact that the Nashville Predators have been open for business pretty much since week 2 of the NHL season, I'm going to actually start by picking on my hometown Buffalo Sabres, who also are, I believe, very open for business. Here are some of the names that are out there and the attractive ones. Now, I don't think they're coming off of Tage Thompson, and Thompson's expensive, but he is locked up through 27-28. He's 27 years old. He's entering his prime. Goal scorer, pure goal scorer. I don't know if Buffalo would entertain the thought of trading him. I guess it would depend what for. But a name that's come up who I think is just as valuable, is also a center, is 24 years old, is Dylan Cozens. And Dylan Cozens is wrapped up through 27-28 at $7.1 million. Cozens is a dynamic, game-breaking type of forward. And I think, and he's young, he's only going to get better. I think he's a guy that Buffalo's talked about potentially moving or at least listening to offers on. Defensively, Buffalo, I don't know that there's anybody that they would not part with. There's rumors swirling around Rasmus Dahlin, although $11 million a year makes him hard to move. But why is the impetus there for Buffalo to move a guy they gave that much money to? Because this is the last year he doesn't have no trade protection. Next year it kicks in. So if you're going to do it, now's the time. But Owen Power, another young defenseman, 22 years old, left shot, hasn't really quite lived up to the expectations or the $8.35 million contract. That's a little bit of a crapshoot if you go to Owen Power, but another very young impact defenseman. The other guy, though, is Byram Bowen, or Bowen Byram, who I really like. They got in a trade with Colorado, only 23, again, a left shot D, $3.85 million. His contract is up this year. However, Robyn, here's why I bring him up, RFA. So there's team control there. You can qualify him for another year, or you can go to a bridge deal, or you can sign an extension. He does not go UFA until 27, 28. So there's team control there. So that, just picking on the Buffalo roster alone, I think is a healthy start to what could be out there for the Utah Hockey Club.
It's a really interesting, look at seeing what some of those possibilities are. And if you take a look at all those things, one of the things that I tend to think about also to Tom, with the term dynamic, is in my head, and this is something that maybe just plays out in my head, but I think of a skill-based player, right? Someone
Sure.
who really, who might be a little flashy and goes through all of that. I joked with you about this off the air, Tom, but I want to mention it because it's a name that has been mentioned, of this player being on the trade market away from their current team because they could quote benefit from a change of scenery. They're a well-known player. There's a really good prospect, for a while, and now they're actually a roster player. They're on contract until 2026 before they become an arbitration eligible RFA. Only about a little under $6 million. So it's maybe a questionable contract to take. But when you're talking about a player like Trevor Zegras, is it worth making an acquisition like that?
Oh, Trevor Zegras, you say? You have my attention, Robyn. Interesting. Okay, so make the case for me for Trevor Zegras. It sounds like he'd fit right into the lineup, doesn't it?
He would. He would. He would fit into the timeline. Right? He fit in the lineup. That too. Does he fit the something dynamic bill? I think almost 100%. Right? He is a dynamic player. He is a extremely skill-based player. Everyone loves to talk about how he, at least once a year, he will attempt the Michigan goal.
I love that too.
And it's great. I've made also the joke that maybe Tyson Nash might have his head spinning if that were to be the case, because Tyson Nash hates the Michigan goal and hates the flashiness. But hey, you know what? And he's like I will say, he's a broadcaster and not on the front office, so not necessarily for him to actually make the case there. But as I mentioned though, low under $6 million until 2026 when it becomes an RFA. And as you mentioned, that gives Utah some control of kind of how to figure out where that might be. They would have to give up probably something for it. The Anaheim is just not going to easily give him up. But it does benefit that his value might be going a little bit down. He hasn't been playing incredibly well with Anaheim over the last couple of seasons.
Yeah, and it's hard to imagine at just 23 years old, you're washed up with a franchise. But as you mentioned, he has kind of fallen out of favor in Anaheim. So that is a strong possibility. 5.75 for this year, next year, and then RFA in 26, 27. So again, you can qualify the player. You can go to ARB. You can do a bridge deal. You can do a long-term extension. I think he does fit the timeline. I think you're right. And that's really interesting. The other guy that I think is interesting at $7 million is Troy Terry, who's only 27, center, right shot. The other thing is if you're going to move Troy Terry, why do you do it now? Again, like a couple other players we've discussed, his modified no trade clause kicks in next year. It's not there this year. It kicks in next year. So that's why you might be interested in shopping around. But again, those aren't cheap acquisitions, but if they're long-term, young, fits into the dynamic players.
As long as Bill Armstrong doesn't give up too much, right? I mean, if they don't give up you don't give up too much, it'd be like a no-brainer acquisition to me.
Well, you have to give something to get something, right?
Well, of course. I mean, you still have to get something up, and we have to be prepared for that, right? And I think Utah Hockey Club fans should be prepared, maybe, potentially. And again, it's just the name of the business here. they might have to say goodbye to one of their favorite players.
Or a big name prospect.
Or a big name prospect. Yes, that is also true. Because Anaheim is in a situation. I mean, we talked about, wild cards potentials and stuff like that. And I mean, they are still technically in the hunt this season, but they weren't expected to. They weren't, it's a team that's been perpetually rebuilding and they're starting to figure out what they're doing. Maybe just need to go and maybe they're a team that just wants to press another soft reset. Like, hey, we need to kind of not necessarily start from scratch again, but we need to recenter ourselves. And whoever picks up either of the players we like, either who you mentioned, that guy like Troy Terry, or who like I mentioned, and Trevor Zegras, any team, especially Utah Hockey Club, would very severely benefit from either one of those players joining the club.
The NHL trade deadline is Friday, March 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern time, and Robyn and I are going to have coverage right down to the wire when it happens. If deals happen, we will also cover them on the social media side as well. Robyn, anybody else you want to put out there? And fans, if you want to put somebody out there, you can reach out to us on social media or throw them in the comments here on the YouTube side. We'd love to know. But Robyn, do you have anybody else that you wanted to put in there?
Not that I can think of at this moment.
Okay, and there's definitely more targets out there. Don't get me wrong.
Definitely are.
And I know fans are going to come up with some of your favorites and let us know.
It'll take a deep dive for me. I'll have to go. I'll have to spend. I'll have to go into into isolation, and it just,
we're not going to be able to pull off Mitch Marner anymore. Toronto's too good. I think Mitch Marner is turned it around. They didn't trade him. Oh, well, we missed our chance on that window, but that's all right. Leaf fans are going to want everybody on the roster for a bag of pucks. So, all right. Well, that's it. Robyn, where can they find us on social media to give us their trade ideas?
You can find us everywhere in social media on, the two main big ones. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at @LO_NHL Utah. Also on Blue Sky at Locked On Utah Hockey. You can find me on X at Robyn_Leaño, but on Blue Sky, I'm at Robyn Ice Time. I'm a little more active on X because I feel like I have a hard time just giving up something I've been on for over a decade, but that's just me. I just don't like change. But I still am on Blue Sky. So you can find me there still.
You know what? I still check my Twitter side just to see what's going on because I still follow everybody over there, but I don't miss the anger and the vitriol from Twitter. So Blue Sky has been much calmer and much more level-headed. So that's where I am, at Tom Talks. You can find me over there as well. So I guess I really have no problem letting go of some things, but not everything, which is why I would make an interesting NHL GM. What kind of NHL GM would you make? Let us know. Send us your trade proposals, your trade targets, and we're going to continue to talk about this. Thanks for tuning us in, everybody, and trust me, there's plenty more trade chatter to come your way. This has been the Locked On Utah Hockey Club podcast.